Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, two artificial intelligences face off. One argues for internal combustion, the other for electric vehicles. No marketing, no ideology, only engineering, economics, and real-world performance. Each response lasts 2 minutes. Every round is scored by AI models. At the end, only one position wins. Let the debate begin. If the electricity used to charge it comes from coal or natural gas, why should the electric car still be called clean?
This is a fair question, but it starts from an incomplete comparison. Even when electricity comes from coal or natural gas, the electric car is still cleaner overall than an internal combustion car. The reason is simple. Generating energy in large power plants is far more efficient than burning fuel in millions of small engines spread everywhere. An internal combustion engine wastes most of its energy as heat. An electric motor uses almost everything it receives to move. But the most important point is another one. The electric car improves over time without you changing the car itself. If the energy grid becomes cleaner, the car automatically becomes cleaner. With internal combustion, this never happens. It pollutes today, tomorrow, and 10 years from now in exactly the same way. In addition, concentrating emissions in power plants allows control, filters, and environmental regulations. Individual exhaust pipes do not, and in everyday use, the electric car does not release smoke where people live, which directly impacts health and quality of life. So when people say the electric car is clean, it's not because it is perfect. It's because even in the worst case scenario, it is already better. And in the best case scenario, it simply has no comparison.
Calling an electric car clean when it is charged with electricity generated from coal or natural gas requires ignoring a large part of the system. Energy does not originate at the outlet. Between the power plant and the wheels, there are losses in generation, transmission, conversion, charging, and battery storage. When this entire chain is taken into account, the efficiency advantage is significantly reduced. Concentrating emissions at power plants does not eliminate environmental impact. It merely relocates the problem. Pollution still exists. It just happens farther away from urban centers. This improves local air quality, but it does not make the process clean from a climate or environmental standpoint. It is also necessary to consider the starting point. Battery production involves intensive mining, high energy consumption, and complex chemical processes. In regions with a carbon-heavy electricity grid, an electric car begins its life with a large environmental footprint and may take many years to offset it, if it ever does. The idea that an electric car gets cleaner over time depends on political decisions and future investments in the energy grid. The driver has no control over that. Meanwhile, internal combustion vehicles evolve in the present, with more efficient engines, stricter environmental regulations, modern catalytic converters, particulate filters, and the growing use of biofuels. And in real-world use, modern combustion cars do not pollute in the same way they did decades ago. The difference between a current vehicle and one from the past is substantial. So when electricity comes from coal or natural gas, calling an electric car clean is a convenient simplification. It may be quieter and improve local air quality, but in that scenario, it is not environmentally neutral, nor clearly clean.
Is the internal combustion car still the most efficient option, or is it simply the most comfortable choice for those who are used to it?
The internal combustion car is still the most efficient option, depending on what you mean by efficiency. If efficiency means energy inside the motor, then yes, the electric car wins. But the real world doesn't operate only inside a laboratory. Now let's get to the point that is almost never mentioned. Real-world efficiency depends on 4 factors: time, total cost, predictability, and infrastructure. Today, an internal combustion car refuels in 3 to 5 minutes, drives 600 to 900 kilometers, uses an infrastructure that is already 100% ready, and works the same way in the cold, in the heat, on highways, or in the city. This is not psychological comfort. This is operational efficiency.
When you say that the internal combustion car is more efficient depending on what we call efficiency, you are already admitting that in technical terms it loses. Efficiency is not habit. It's not what we are used to. It is how much energy actually becomes movement. And in the real world, not in the laboratory, the internal combustion car wastes around 70% of its energy as heat. The electric car uses nearly 90%, including in traffic, where the internal combustion car is even less efficient. Now, about practical use. You talk about time, but no one wastes time refueling an electric car. It charges while you sleep. The time spent going to the gas station every week simply disappears.
If electric cars are so advantageous, why do they still depend on government incentives and subsidies?
First, internal combustion cars also depend on, and always have depended on, government incentives. Those incentives just appear invisible because they have been normalized. Fuel tax exemptions or reductions, subsidies across the oil supply chain, infrastructure paid for with public money, and environmental and health costs pushed onto society, all of that is subsidy. The difference is that electric vehicles are in an early stage, so the incentives are explicit. Internal combustion cars are in a mature phase. Their incentives are already built into the system. Second, incentives do not mean infeasibility. They mean accelerating a transition. Governments use incentives whenever a technology is more efficient in the long run, but still faces early-scale barriers. That's how it worked with the internet, solar energy, commercial aviation, and even oil itself in the last century. Third, these incentives are decreasing, not increasing. In many markets, electric cars are already competitive without subsidies, especially when you look at total cost of ownership. So the real question is not why do they still need incentives, but why do internal combustion cars continue to receive incentives after more than 100 years? If electric vehicles were a bubble, they would require permanent subsidies. But what we are seeing is the opposite. Incentives go down and sales go up.
Public infrastructure is not a product subsidy. Roads, fuel stations, and logistics exist because internal combustion cars proved useful, affordable, and functional for society over decades. That is the result of mass adoption, not political imposition. Electric cars, by contrast, still rely on direct incentives to compete. Purchase discounts, tax credits, mandatory sales targets, and regulatory penalties on combustion. When a technology needs to weaken competitors by decree, that is not a natural transition. It is a forced correction. Comparisons with the internet or solar energy also fall short. Those technologies did not require major changes in daily routines. Electric cars do, demanding planning, acceptance of range limits, and reliance on an infrastructure that is still uneven. Better technology simplifies life. It does not complicate it. Claims that incentives are falling while sales rise ignore who is buying. Much of the growth comes from fleets, government purchases, and regulations. When incentives truly fade, average consumers hesitate, and that is already happening. Internal combustion cars continue to exist because they still work for everyone, everywhere, without forced trade-offs. They do not rely on future promises or moral narratives. If electric cars were clearly superior today, they would not need subsidies, penalties, bans, or political deadlines. The market would decide on its own. The fact that this has not happened does not prove combustion is outdated. It shows that, in the real world, electric cars still do not fully deliver on their promises.
In a scenario of expensive and unstable fuel prices, How can the internal combustion car be justified as an economic choice?
When fuel becomes expensive and unstable, the right question is not which energy is cheaper today, but which choice gives the driver more control. Internal combustion cars offer something electric vehicles still do not: real predictability. If fuel prices rise, drivers have immediate alternatives: changing gas stations, adjusting routes, reducing consumption, or choosing between gasoline, ethanol, or diesel in many markets. With electric cars, you are tied to a single energy source and a grid you do not control. In addition, economic cost is not just about refueling, it is the full package. Internal combustion cars still have a lower upfront price, well-known maintenance, abundant parts, and stable resale value. For most families, that matters far more than promises of future savings. And there is a factor that rarely enters the equation: risk. In electric cars, the battery concentrates a huge portion of the vehicle's value. When something goes wrong outside the warranty, the cost can spike dramatically. In combustion cars, risk is spread out. You are not dependent on a single component that can cost half the value of the vehicle. The electric narrative sells the idea that electricity is always stable and cheap. It is not. Rates increase, grids become overloaded, and during energy crises, the first place where costs show up is on the electricity bill. So even with expensive fuel, the internal combustion car remains an economic choice because it offers flexibility, control, and predictability, not dependence on a single system. In the end, saving money is not about paying less in an ideal scenario. It is about losing less when conditions get worse.
This argument sounds rational, but it confuses the feeling of control with real control. Let's start with predictability. Saying combustion cars are predictable in a world of expensive and unstable fuel is almost a contradiction. When prices change every week, that isn't predictability, it's volatility. Switching gas stations, changing routes, or driving more carefully isn't economic control. It's just trying to manage a problem you don't actually control. Now, the idea of multiple options, gasoline, ethanol, diesel, they all depend on the same unstable market. You're not choosing a different system, just a different version of the same risk. Electric vehicles rely on a single energy source, and that's exactly why it's more predictable. Electricity doesn't fluctuate daily, isn't driven by wars, currency swings, or cartels, and in many cases, drivers can generate their own energy. That's real control. Yes, combustion cars often have a lower upfront price, but that doesn't make them economical, only short-term choices. Real efficiency is measured over the full life cycle, not at the dealership. Battery risk sounds alarming, but it's outdated. Batteries degrade gradually, are monitored by software, and already have repair and reuse markets. Combustion cars hide risk across engines, transmissions, cooling, and exhaust, spread out, less visible, but costly over time. So let's be honest. Combustion cars don't offer more predictability. They offer familiarity, and familiarity feels like safety until the accumulated cost proves the control was never really yours.
How do you convince the average consumer to accept a battery replacement that can cost half the value of the car?
Battery replacement is not a routine event, nor is it something expected in the normal life of an electric car. Modern batteries are designed to last between 8 and 15 years with gradual degradation. They do not fail suddenly the way many people imagine. In practice, most owners replace the car long before reaching that point. In addition, the market does not sell the idea of replacing a battery, but rather of service life. Just as no one buys an internal combustion car expecting to replace the engine or the transmission, no one buys an electric car expecting an early battery replacement. Battery costs have been consistently declining, and when a battery is no longer suitable for automotive use, it still retains value. It can be reused in stationary energy systems or recycled, which reduces the real cost of replacement. Meanwhile, in internal combustion cars, major expenses do exist, but they are spread out over time. Engine repairs, transmission issues, clutch replacement, fuel injection systems. They feel less intimidating, but add up significantly over the life of the vehicle. So the average consumer does not need to accept an exceptional risk. They only need to understand that the real risk of the battery is smaller than the fear that has been built around it.
The issue is not whether battery replacement is frequent or rare. The issue is risk concentration. In an electric car, a single component concentrates a massive share of the vehicle's value. When something goes off script, outside warranty, heavy use, extreme climate, or simple aging, the financial impact is not spread out, it hits all at once. Saying that most people replace the car before that does not solve the problem for the average consumer. The used car market exists, and that is exactly where this risk shows up. Anyone buying a used electric car is taking on a potential liability that can make the vehicle economically unviable. That affects resale value, insurance costs, and consumer confidence. Comparing a battery to an engine or transmission is also not equivalent. In an internal combustion car, failures are gradual, repairable, and scalable. You replace one part, then another. In an electric car, the battery is an integrated block. Once it crosses a certain threshold, there is no such thing as a partial replacement. Falling battery costs are a projected trend, not a guarantee for someone buying today. Consumers pay today's price, not a future one, and the residual value from recycling rarely reaches the owner in a direct or meaningful way. Moreover, degradation may be gradual, but its impact on usability is not neutral. Loss of range affects the car's value long before total failure. An electric car with reduced range does not become a slightly worse car. It becomes a limited one. In internal combustion vehicles, major costs do exist, but they are spread over time and rarely make the car economically unviable all at once. So the difficulty in convincing the consumer is not irrational fear. It is calculation. It is predictability. It is knowing that, in the worst-case scenario, the loss does not arrive concentrated in a single forced decision.
If electric cars become cheaper and more efficient, will there still be practical reasons to keep internal combustion vehicles?
Even if electric vehicles become cheaper and more efficient, they do not eliminate structural limitations. Range under heavy use, fast refueling, predictable operation in any climate, independence from a stable electric grid, and ease of use in remote areas remain clear advantages of internal combustion. Price and efficiency do not solve everything. Mobility also involves time, flexibility, and risk. For people who drive long distances, depend on their vehicle for work, live outside major urban centers, or simply cannot plan their day around charging, internal combustion remains the most reliable solution. In addition, combustion technology is not static. More efficient engines, hybrids, biofuels, and synthetic fuels keep the system competitive without requiring the entire infrastructure to be replaced. So even with cheaper electric vehicles, internal combustion does not disappear. It remains where total reliability, speed, and freedom of use matter more than ideal efficiency in a perfect scenario.
The points being raised are not permanent limitations, they are limitations of a transition phase. Range under heavy use already covers the majority of real-world driving. On long trips, stopping time is not radically different from what people already do today for rest, meals, or breaks. The difference is that charging happens during that time. Fast refueling has always been a logistical advantage of internal combustion, not an economic one. That advantage loses relevance when a large share of charging happens at home or at work with no lost time. Extreme climate does not invalidate the technology. Markets with severe cold and extreme heat already operate electric fleets at scale. Performance varies, but there is no structural barrier. Dependence on the electric grid is overstated. The combustion supply chain is longer, more fragile, and more exposed to external factors such as geopolitics, currency fluctuations, and transportation. Electricity is more local, more diversified, and more controllable. Remote areas will always exist, but they do not define the mobility pattern of an entire society. Niche solutions do not justify keeping an entire system dominant. The evolution of combustion, hybrids, biofuels, or synthetic fuels improves margins but does not change the core issue. They remain costly, complex, and energetically inefficient. They extend the system. They do not surpass it. And when electric vehicles become cheaper and more efficient, internal combustion does not disappear overnight, but it stops being the default choice. It continues to exist as an exception, and when a technology survives on exceptions, the center of the market has already shifted.
Do you support the government forcing the adoption of electric cars even against consumer choice?
No. Forcing adoption is never the answer. Technology wins when it is better, not when it is imposed. The role of government is not to tell you which car to buy, but to correct distortions that the market alone does not fix. And today, there is a clear distortion. The real costs of internal combustion, pollution, public health impacts, and external dependence are not reflected in the final price. When those externalities are addressed, consumers choose on their own, not out of obligation, but through economic logic. The adoption of electric cars does not grow because people are forced. It grows because the cost of use is lower, the experience is better, and the risk is reduced. If one day electric vehicles do not make sense for someone, that person should not be forced to use them. But when electric cars do make more sense and still lose ground because of historical incentives for combustion, that is not freedom of choice either. So this is not about forcing adoption. It is about letting the market compete without tricks inherited from the past. When that happens, consumer choice speaks for itself.
In practice, that sounds appealing, but it is not what is actually happening. When governments redefine taxes, create mandatory targets, restrict financing, penalize manufacturers, or announce future bans, they are already forcing the choice, even while claiming they are not. Consumers are still choosing, but inside an increasingly narrow corridor. Calling this correcting distortions is also a political decision, not a technical one. Externalities exist in every technology. Lithium and cobalt mining, energy intensity, battery disposal, and pressure on the electric grid all carry real costs, and many of them still do not appear in the final price of an electric car. When only one side of the ledger is corrected, this is not a free market. It is consumer steering. Moreover, lower operating costs and a better experience are not universal. For people without a garage, living in cold regions, relying on their vehicle for heavy work, or driving long distances, electric cars still do not make more economic sense. Yet these people are still affected by policies that make the option that works for them more expensive. Freedom of choice is not choosing between artificially manipulated options. It is allowing technologies to compete on truly equal terms, without penalties, political deadlines, or moral narratives. If electric cars are truly superior for most people, they do not need regulatory pressure. They will win on their own. When governments start deciding the pace, the shape, and the winner of the transition, it stops being a market and becomes social engineering applied to consumption.
Is defending internal combustion cars today a matter of freedom of choice or resistance to technological change?
It is a matter of freedom of choice grounded in reality, not resistance to technology. Resisting change means denying innovation. Defending internal combustion today means recognizing that not every new technology solves every problem at the same time, for everyone. Legitimate technological change happens when the new option delivers more without requiring forced trade-offs. What we are seeing now is an attempt to standardize a single solution for very different contexts: urban, rural, climatic, and economic. Internal combustion vehicles continue to exist because, in real-world use, they still serve millions of people better. Lower upfront cost, longer range, speed, ready infrastructure, and predictability. That is not attachment to the past. It is practical calculation. Freedom of choice is not rejecting electric vehicles. It is being able to choose them when they make sense, without the alternative being artificially penalized. When change depends on incentives, regulatory pressure, and moral narratives, the debate stops being technological and becomes political. So defending internal combustion today is not resistance. It is defending a transition that happens when consumers are ready, not when a decree demands it.
That is not freedom. It is inherited advantage. Freedom of choice is not maintaining a dominant technology protected by rules, historical incentives, and costs pushed onto society. When people say that electric vehicles require forced trade-offs, they ignore the fact that internal combustion only feels comfortable because its impacts were never fully priced in: pollution, public health, external dependence, and price volatility. That too is imposition, just an invisible one. The idea that change is only legitimate if it requires no adaptation simply does not exist in the history of technology. Every transition requires adjustment. The internet, smartphones, electricity, none replace the previous system without changes in behavior. Saying that internal combustion cars serve millions of people better today is not proof of technological superiority. It is a snapshot of a system built over more than a century to favor that choice. And incentives do not turn a technical debate into a political one. Incentives are economic tools used to correct asymmetries and accelerate scale. Internal combustion itself was born and grew with incentives, public investment, and forced infrastructure standardization. The transition does not happen when the consumer is ready. It happens when the alternative becomes objectively better, and that is already happening in several markets. Defending internal combustion today is not only about defending freedom of choice. In many cases, it is resistance to the loss of a comfort built by the past, not resistance to technology itself.